Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I apologise, just to explain that the loop which was going to be on more or less had the faces of all those who were aboard the Iolaire that night that appeared in the darkest dawn. That is the book that Aker are trying to sell to you if you haven't already got a copy or if you need a second copy. There was also an image of the vessel. Quite often it's misrepresented because there were two vessels called the Iolaire, and it was the second one that actually sank, but we'll come to that later on. To go back to the very beginning, I'm just going to talk about from the war onwards. Just before the war, the islands of Lewis and Harris were sustained by herring fishing mostly, and crofting had started to help with monies going into the bank, if they did have a bank, because from before the 1886 Act, the crofters didn't make much money at all. The islands were owned by the Madisons and the Scots down in Harris. There was limited untarred roads, and Harris Tweed was in its infancy. One of the things that sustained the islanders was serving in the reserves. That is, the army reserves, which the Seaforths, the 3rd Battalion of Seaforths, for instance, in 1900, they were the garrison in Egypt during the time of the Boer War. And of the 960 men in the 3rd Battalion, 780 were Lewis men. So it just shows you how many were interested in these things. The 2nd Battalion, including a lot of Lewis men, went to the Boer War. But there was some trouble in Egypt at that time. There's always been trouble in that area, as you all know. But the reason why these men were in the army was there was a retainer. But the biggest retainer was with the Royal Naval Reserve. And at Battery Point, which was Iolaire Point before it became known as that, was the largest Royal Naval Reserve establishment. It was a training establishment, and men came from Easter Ross across to be trained in aspects of naval things like gunnery, which started with field guns, and with various things like splicing ropes. I could go on all night, drill, etc. But in 1904, with turret guns starting to come, the men started going onto ships, and they were trained for, I think it was 6 weeks a year. 6 weeks a year they'd do it. If not, they didn't get the retainer. The men enjoyed it because it was a holiday away from the women and the peats and things like that. So it was a wee holiday where they could have a pint or two together and camaraderie built up. And that was to help them all during the war. So when the war broke out in 1914, it was delivered. The news was delivered on a Sunday, and it was read out from the pulpits, which was hard to believe for Lewis back then. And vans were sent out from Stornoway. There was very, very limited vehicles then. Some of it was done by horse and cart, and the men had to turn up at the R&R base in Stornoway, which it hadn't really started then, but the R&R men went to the customs house in Stornoway and got travel documents to travel away with their kit bags. And a lot of them that were in Fraserburgh and other fishing ports had to report to the various bases. The R&R bases were Chatham and Devonport and Portsmouth. They all had their numbers and went there with their train warrants. The soldiers went away as well, and as you know, the Sheila was a very, very small boat, so it was quite busy for weeks on end. Immediately, the men, although the reserves, they went into action, and there were several of the men that were on the Iolaire, for instance, were on HMS Kent, which fought at the Battle of the Falklands in 1914. So immediately they went in there. Soldiers were in the trenches, and quite a lot of the reservists in the Seaforths, Camerons and Gordons were killed in November 1914. So it just shows you how well trained they were and how willing they were to fight. A lot of the R&R men that were called up immediately found that there was no actual ship for them to go on. So a lot of them were used because Britain had a small standing army of 400,000 men, whereas France, Germany, Russia had something between 4 and 6 million men. And so they were used as soldiers in the Royal Naval Division. And some of them were captured and had to go, well, were captured, some of them were captured, but a lot of them went into Holland when they were retreating and were interned at Groningen. I think we've got Guido Blockland here tonight as an expert on that aspect of the war. And these men were interned there until 1918. They got special permission from the Dutch authorities to come home and do the harvest, do the peats, and then return to Holland. If one of them hadn't returned, they wouldn't have, that would have been the end of it all. So through the war, a lot of the sailors then went on to the armed drifters, motor launches, yachts, and armed trawlers. That's because Lewis men and Harris men were known as sailors. They knew how to throw a rope and tie up a boat, and they didn't get seasick like a man from Birmingham would, and they were put on battleships and larger ships. In the war, 1,167 Lewis men are officially registered on the Lewis War Memorial, but there's at least 100, coming up to about 117, 120 men who are registered with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission as coming from the island, and they're not on the Lewis War Memorial. So when it came to October 1918, the war was just coming to an end, and the HMY Iolaire, I must say HMS Iolaire was the base in Stornoway, and every shore base had a ship named after it. And so HMY Iolaire, in fact the base had taken its name from the yacht Iolaire, and it sailed away and was replaced by HMY Amalthea, and they changed names, so that explains why there was two yachts. Now the first one was modern, twin screw, and could do 18 knots, and the second one was single screw and only could do 10 knots. Now that's quite vital when you look into the tragedy in the end. On the 11th of November there was the armistice, and the sailors weren't immediately demobbed, of course, because they were in ships. They were still fighting on the White Sea and the Black Sea, and there was mines that had to be cleared. So it was decided that they wouldn't be demobbed really until the spring of 1919. At Christmas, it was decided by the Admiralty that English and Welsh sailors would have Christmas off, and that the Scottish and Irish sailors would have New Year. Again, that has a telling effect. And so, from Portsmouth, Chatham and Devonport, the R&R men set up, and from their ships, and also from bases at Larne, Rosyth, and indeed one man from Gibraltar. And quite a large number came from Scapa Flow. Now, they had to come across, well, let's put it this way. They came from the south of England, and one sailor who survived the Iolaire said that from Glasgow until he got eventually to Kyle of Lochalsh, it took him 18 hours. So it was quite a long journey. And some of the English-based sailors said that the first food they had from setting off from the south of England was when they got to Perth Station, and they got a sandwich and a cup of tea. So, and it was these corridor trains, and some of them were sitting in their kit bags. So they were very, very tired by the time they got to Inverness. And at Inverness, they had to wait for what was called another train coming down from Wick called the Jellicoe Special, which came from the Admiral Jellicoe, of course, and the Scapa Flow battle fleet. So the trains had to come down and meet at Inverness. And this held up the trains that were awaiting. There was supposed to be 3 trains going to Cailford. Eventually there was only 2. And they were as they were delayed, they were quite late going to Cailford. Now, the Admiralty, when the sailors congregated at Inverness, suddenly realised we've got a lot of men, we can't cope with them with the Sheila. So they summoned HMY Iolaire across from Stornoway. Now, for some reason, they didn't send any of the armed trawlers over from Stornoway. There's over 100 naval ships in Stornoway. On the 29th, the Iolaire had come over, and an armed trawler as well as the Sheila. So why they didn't send an armed trawler as well? Because when the trains did pull into Kyle, the men trooped off. All on one train, were all sailors, of course, went onto the Iolaire, and the other train came in, and the first file of sailors went onto the Sheila, the mailboat. The soldiers that were on the trains and the civilians also went onto the Sheila. And in the dark, because it was only gas lamps, people were trying to get from one ship to another, and they were jumping over rails, so they weren't just going down gangplanks where they'd be stopped. So there's a bit of confusion as to how many people were on board the ships. The Iolaire actually set sail at 7:30 and the Sheila at 8. And one man on the Sheila at 7:30 saw the boat leaving, and he jumped over the railing and landed much lower down with a large thump. And he was amongst one of the men who were lost on the Iolaire. That was Roderick Mackenzie from 5 Sordale. So just choices on the hoof could cost lives. When the Iolaire set sail, it was a force 2, if you want to call it, not even a gale, not even a breeze. But by the time they had reached the Shants, there was a wind getting up behind them, and they were seen jumping. There's lots of lights about. From Kebbuck Head, there's a light there, the Millade light. They were seeing the lights on the other side, and eventually they saw Arnish. Now, at 1 o'clock, the gale was up, and it was about a force 7 then, and the man who had just left, was just leaving the wheel, was a James McLean. Well, he would be called a coxswain, and he left at 1 o'clock, and he was a survivor, and it's really from his testimony we have any idea as to what the yacht was doing in terms of navigation. When he left, he said that the commander, Richard Mason, was still there, but Mason left 5 minutes after that, and Lieutenant Cotter came on deck, and the wheel was taken over by Ernest Leggett, who was to be lost. Now, the whole thing about the Iolaire is, a lot of people don't realise, up on the bridge was open, and the wheelhouse was down below, and it was by voice pipe that they were in contact with one another. And as they came into Stornoway, there was no lookout. That was one of the findings of the inquiry, no lookout. And they turned in. Well, there was got to be said, there was a fishing boat called the Spider. It actually was close beside them, and they got a crewman to actually come to the inquiry and talk about what had happened and what course she was taking. Now, they didn't actually get the skipper, and this crewman, well, he was actually an engine man, and how he knew the course, etc., was all very complicated, and I thought he actually said that the Iolaire drove straight at the beasts of Holm, whereas most of the crewmen and other witnesses said that she had come in close to the Holm shore, past Holm Island, and went inside the beasts, which you can see there was a marker there then. Some people say it was a lit marker. It's never been lit and still isn't. There is a buoy beside it nowadays. And she went in there about 6 yards with inside I think it was 7 yards, according to Angus Nicholson, who was aboard and was from the Battery area and was a fisherman, a skipper. So his testimony I would trust far better, because they didn't say who the engine man, where he came from or anything, and I still don't know who he was. So the Iolaire hit the rocks. It jolted over to the starboard side, and a lot of the men aboard who were just gathering their kit bags, cases, coats, everything. Some were in the saloon, some were up on deck. There were 2 saloons actually, the deck saloon and down in the hull. They were just ready to come into Stornoway, and some of them thought they had hit a mine or they'd been torpedoed, and some of them already had been. And so they jumped in, some of them fell into the sea and some jumped into the sea. And witnesses said none of them came back. And apparently a lot of them were quite good swimmers. By this time, the yacht was canted over and the waves were crashing over the hull on its side. The lights were still on, and the commander, it was Lieutenant Cotter on the bridge, decided to ring the alarms to go astern, and this only caused a greater gash in the hull, and more water came aboard. And from then on, she didn't really move for a while. It was dark, there was no moon, and the searchlight wasn't working. So until Lieutenant Cotter fired Veery lights, and 1 or 2 rockets were also fired by one of the crew from Point. It was only then that they realised where they were, exactly where they were at Holm, although some of the crew didn't know where they were. Those who had fished out of Stornoway certainly did know. So it was a frightening situation for them. The yacht started moving around and actually came out with the actual rocks itself before being driven in slightly closer to the shore. And the men aboard decided then to launch the starboard lifeboats, which were both swamped because they were there was too many men on them. There was a whaler and a dinghy on each side. The whaler could hold about 20, perhaps 14 safely, and the dinghy even less than that. So, but men did come back off them. They were waterlogged rather than capsized. From that, there was nobody really getting ashore. There was one man swam ashore, a McKeever man from Stornoway, and he was the first to reach the farmhouse, but I'll come back to that. It was, by then, very few had left and survived. They were seen going underwater. And it was then a man who I'm going to talk about later, John Finlay Macleod. This is a man who in 1916 had applied not to join up because he thought he could do a better job back at home. But then he went to HMS Ganges and taught all the sailors there how to be sailors. He was like a headmaster or a petty officer type trainer for them. So accomplished was he as a seaman. He decided, and he said he wasn't a particularly good swimmer. I think you'll agree with that, Ian. He said that. And he decided he was going to go with a painter. That's a small rope. And he dived in. And he was hit by the waves and driven under the yacht. And Donald Morrison, known as Patch, he was later to be the man who was up the mast, said, in Gaelic obviously, like, he's a goner. We won't see him again. But he popped up again. And he said that he had studied the waves. And he watched them come in, 1, 2, and picked the largest wave, and he ended up above the rocks, just before the grass, and he managed to get a foothold. And from that, he got a larger rope, a hawser type rope, and then another man came over. He was able to hold it while another man came, and it became easier once a third man had arrived. But the yacht was canting like this with the waves, and the spray was over, and it was quite a really awful night, and the rockets were running out. But the thing is, the rope was tightening and then slackening, and people had been hit by waves and coming off the rope. But 40 men did survive, all thanks to a hero from Ness. The others were lucky. The yacht was splaying about, and at least 6 managed to jump onto the rocks as the stern went over. And later on, just before she sank, two of the men from the stokers, they got ashore, and both of them, actually, Chris, were Welsh. Well, they were actually, one was Scots and one was English, but they lived in Wales. And I always remember there was some actually towards the end got ashore using one of the empty lifeboats that was lying. It just swung round, and they more or less tripped and only had to jump about 4 or 5 feet onto the rocks over the water. It was just, if there was light and they could see where they were, when most of the men were at the other end of the boat, still trying to get off. And Donald Murray from Tulsa, one of the last men, said that he was terrified to go, but he decided, well, it's either this or stay on and drown. So I could drown on the rope, but he got ashore, and he said after he got ashore, there was only about 1 or 2 others, and the rope snapped. And then the lights went out. The lights went out, so there's no lights, and the men that were left weren't seeing anything, really. And at 3:25, the yacht disappeared under the waves, leaving her 2 masts up above, but they were leaning over at an angle. Murray had mentioned earlier on, he found himself under the water, but felt rigging, and he pulled himself up the rigging and found himself coming up one of the masts. And he climbed to the top, and he said he thought there was a man behind him. And by this time it was a force 10 gale, and sleet was falling regularly. He thought he saw the other mast with 2 men up it. And at 6 in the morning, he heard a crack, and the other mast had broken, and the 2 men disappeared. And he had to stay there until 10 in the morning when the wind moderated. By this time, those that had reached the shore were walking barefoot because they had cast off their sea boots and ordinary shoes, and were walking in either bare feet or stocking soles across the moor to Stonyfield farmhouse, which had lit up once the McKeever man from Church Street had arrived. And the farmer Anderson Young and his wife had just gone to bed, and their servants provided the men with hot milk, tea, coffee, etc. It was the men were arriving full of thistles and gorse, because they couldn't see where they were going in the dark. Their knees were scraped, their hands scraped because of the rocks. And they reached, as I said, they reached the farmhouse, and Anderson Young jumped on his bike and went down to where the Atlanta is now, where the Imperial Hotel was there, and that was the Admiralty base for Rear Admiral R.F. Boyle. And when they got there, the 2 sentries thought he was drunk because he was out of breath. And then once they realised, as he got his breath back, that he was sober, they let him in. And the news had percolated ashore. And eventually men started arriving they'd left the farmhouse and started walking into the town. Also, the Sheila had gone past the actual wreck, seen a light on at Holm shore, and when they got in and saw the Iolaire wasn't there, they said that there's a ship ashore at Holm, and people started heading down to Holm. Well, civilians did. So what was happening once that happened? Well, let's put it this way. It was the first New Year in peacetime. And the Imperial Hotel was a public bar. And I think there was some drinking going on. For some reason, the Rear Admiral sent one man out to tell the lifeboat secretary, tell the lifeboat cocks, and go to 2 houses to get cars. And when it came to the inquiry, all these people were blamed for not. And what had the Admiralty done about it? Where were their cars? How did they not know where lorries were? What if there had been an invasion? I think it was about 6 o'clock before you start seeing the Admiralty making any sensible decisions. By then it was far too late. But when it came to inquiries, it was the locals that were being blamed for everything. For instance, Lieutenant Murray went to the Royal Hotel. He didn't know where the hotel manager was. He was knocking on the Cromwell Street door when he lived on the Kenneth Street side of the building. He went out to Henderson's Close to get Mr. Henderson, the motor hirer, and he took a good 20 minutes, half an hour there. And he had been at the Cali Hotel looking for Mr. MacDonald, another motor hirer, and didn't gain access. And it was only when he found a car going into the post office that he got a car that could go down to Holm. Also, the life-saving apparatus, they couldn't procure the horses in time. In fact, there was 19 men hauled the LSA. It was a wheeled truck. And of course, there was the roads to Stonyfield only stopped at the farms then, so they would have to carry it over the moor, and it would have been far too late in any case. And the subsequent inquiry, went on and on and on about, the lack of horses, and it was just deflecting a problem, and it wasn't a perfect thing. I'll come on to the inquiry again. So in the morning, the gale had subsided, and the bard, Moira McFarlane, said that he went down to Sandwich Shore and he saw some fisher girls heading up to go to work. And the sight he saw bodies coming into Sandwich Shore, and it was a sight to behold. He is quoted as saying that there were like horses, like horses coming ashore with heroes aboard. And my own mother was witness to Sandwich Shore, and some of the sights, there were teddy bears coming in, kit bags, sailors' hats, and some of the men just looked like they were sleeping on the shore. Others looked like they'd been battered badly by the rocks and under the yacht. There was a Crichton boy from, Crichton, one of the Crichtons from Knock. He had 4 children, and beside him there was a bag with 4 oranges in it. And little things like that were affecting everybody. But as the news percolated through the island, apparently it went through Point like a bushfire. It started in Egnish and then gradually Knock. And by the time it reached Aird, they were hearing the whaling coming. And some areas didn't really hear about it until the survivors started going home, or news through cars started to come. It was through the communities, carts started coming from Ness, from Braga, from Uig, and trying to identify them. And Some of them were going back home empty and coming back the following day. The R&R logbook for HMS Iolaire doesn't mention it at all. Sandwich School doesn't mention it at all. Braga School said we'll have to send out the man to get the kids into school. They hadn't heard about it really, but HMS Iolaire, they said nothing in their logbook. And then, we put out search parties after that. But they don't mention the HMS Iolaire sank, HMY Iolaire sank. A rather strange, perhaps they were so shocked by it all. Eventually, a mortuary was set up in the drill hall for the crew because they were going to go away on the Sheila. And a mortuary was set up down at the base itself. And the bodies were taken up there. And those who were barefoot, there was a tag put on their toe with a label with all identifying marks. And if they were wearing boots, they would chalk it on. And so people were trying to identify people either lying on the beach, down at Holm, or in the mortuary. And there was also about 11 or 12 men in a naval hospital as well on Seaview Terrace. So back and forth they came, back and forth, and then the funerals had to start. And it was a tragic time. I'm just going to read an excerpt from the book. This is purely about two brothers. And since the next day, Saturday, the boys went to the cemetery. The sight of coffins with two brothers, John and Alexander Mackenzie from number 16, side by side in the one grave, would never be forgotten. The father of these two boys, Donald, wearing a heavy overcoat, stood at the top of the grave, and when the earth took the coffin out of sight, turned to one side and covered his face with a spotted red handkerchief as he shed his painful, bitter tears. It was sorely memorable to see a clever, energetic, reliable man hurt to the quick. For days the village was under a dark cloud. Not a weaver's shuttle went into a loom. No work was performed except what was necessary. The village was so quiet that even a cock crowing or a dog barking gave one a sudden start. Day after day, news was received that other bodies had been found. Day after day, one could see rows of men in great coats and hats solemnly walking the road to the cemetery. At last the burials ended. Nothing more was to be done, and slowly the village returned to normality. That is just from one family, and it covers the whole island, was covered like that. There was 181 Lewis and Harris men. There was people betrothed to be married, all lost, and it was just a tragedy for the whole island. So there was rumours, questions and queries by the public, and the Stornoway Town Council started an Iolaire fund from the 6th of January onwards, which raised quite a lot of money. But from the worries and concerns, the Admiralty decided to act, and on the 7th, all the survivors, apart from one man from Harris who was unfit to attend and had a doctor's line, submitted a written submission to a 3-man panel of naval officers. Now, all of them did it, as I said, and I think that the other man was sent the form to fill in. There was the only conclusion that they came to was that there was nothing to answer because all the officers had drowned, and that included, the commander and the navigating officer, Lieutenant Cotter. So the public anger grew and grew and grew, and eventually there was a public inquiry. Now, again, the public were not satisfied because 13 of the 80 survivors were called as witnesses. Now, were they selected because they gave a good story? That is an unanswered question, because their records were kept, but there's no sign of all the other survivors' submissions. The actual inquiry lasted for 2 days. That was not unusual, actually. Don't get me wrong. It was quite common when the destroyers Opal and Narborough sank with only one survivor. In Orkney, there was only 2 days as well. But it seemed to be the Admiralty wanted to wash its hands and finish the war off, that they didn't really want to blame anybody, and Rear Admiral Boyle was promoted and retired the following day after the inquiry over. They did acknowledge that there was insufficient lookout, and in fact there was no lookout really. They didn't really investigate the crew that was supposed to be anchoring the Iolaire when she came in. There was one survivor, R.F. Wilder from Kent, who claimed to be the cook, and they didn't question him any further after that. Well, the cook was aboard, and there was a trimmer cook as well. This guy was part of the anchoring crew, and he got away with telling a fib. And that was really quite annoying. James McLean got the brunt of it all, and the questions that were given, because it was the middle of February, they hadn't prepared for it at all. A modern inquiry, they take perhaps years to have an inquiry, and then they take months to go through it, not 2 days. One of the questions James McLean was asked, when you were coming to Stornoway, where was Rona? And he said, I can't answer. Now, they didn't explain, was it North Rona or South Rona, which was miles away and totally irrelevant to Stornoway Harbour, but just shows you that solicitors, can make such a poor judgment geographically without examining things and researching things. Could the tragedy have been avoided? Well, if the faster Iolaire had been on, they would have been in before a different crew as well. They would have been in. The crew, by the way, there was only about half a crew aboard, and they had borrowed 2 sailors from other ships. Well, it's certainly there are lookouts. There's no doubt about it. Nothing would have happened if there had been a moon, if the searchlight had been working, if the radio apparatus hadn't been in the hull, because the telegraphist was down in the hull. Normally in a naval vessel, it's on one of the upper deck cabins. And so the battery was flooded and they weren't able to transmit. There was just so many factors that were wrong. If there had been even later, the weather would have abated and they'd have come in the morning. But once the funerals were over and once the funeral was over and all the burials had happened, came the great silence. Nobody from Berneray, where there was 2 young 18-year-olds, they hadn't another photo taken because I'd only joined in October 1918. And I forgot to mention there was several Harrismen aboard, of which 7 were lost. They were going to walk from Stornoway home. They were so desperate to get home, including one who was going to get married, and his wife had her trousseau already. There was one of the passengers, a Royal Marine. His pregnant wife was on the pier waiting for him. One could go into every single case that was on the Iolaire. But the silence carried on. People in Ness didn't speak about it. My own grandfather was lost in it. My father never spoke to me about it. My mother spoke to me about what she saw on the shore, but she didn't tell me anything until, well, it was 1958 when and it was 1958 when people did start talking about it, because that's when somebody, Alan Cameron from Tulsa, father-in-law of Donald John Macleod, who co-authored The Darkest Dawn, suggested we put up a memorial at Holm. And some people objected to it, but in 1960 the memorial was opened and, well, sorry, it was, I'm trying to remember, it was Provost A.J. Mackenzie ex-Provost A.J. Mackenzie that actually opened it, and Donald J. Stewart laid a wreath. So the Stornoway Gazette then issued a booklet called Sea Sorrow, and from there on people started talking, and then BBC started doing a programme about it and interviewed some of the survivors. And slowly and gradually the total silence lifted, but it still took quite a while, and I would say it was practically up until perhaps the 90th anniversary, and definitely by the centenary, people started talking about it, and schools started doing projects on it. They wanted to find out about it, and I was touched by some of the children. Their attitude towards the tragedy was quite remarkable. There's still a huge interest in the Iolaire and the potential of an Iolaire Maritime Museum. Now, I've talked for long enough, and I think it's about time we asked Chris to come up and take his place. Now, before he comes up, you'll all have known about the John Finlay Macleod. I don't know if you've seen this, Chris. Margaret Ferguson has painted, it's a remarkable. I don't know how many you've done, Margaret. I think it was, well over 100 anyway.
106, and I'm still going.
Quite remarkable. Would you like to come up, Chris?
Well, what an amazing day for me. So just to start, my great-grandfather was a Ness man. He was Donald Finlay Macleod. But he was much older than John, 24 years older. He became a minister in the Kirk. He was the minister in Och on the Black Isle for a while, and then at Partick. And I think a much-loved minister in his church. But today's the first time I've ever seen a photograph of my great-grandfather. And his parents as well. And I've met, I don't know how many people who seem to be relatives of mine. In fact, can anybody just put their hand up in the room who is a relative of mine? Yeah, oh, there's a couple more at the back there. Lovely, thank you. Look, it's absolutely amazing for me to be here. It feels like a sort of homecoming in a way, even though my accent is very, very different from anybody else's here. I just have a few thoughts. The first is that some tragedies are just too painful to tell. I don't know whether you've ever seen the musical Les Mis, but there's the young lad sings Empty Chairs at Empty Tables after all his friends have been killed on the barricades. And it must have, you know, when you think back, it must have been terribly, terribly painful for those who did survive, because they knew others that they'd not. And you'd go, why did I survive and somebody else didn't? Was it just the fluke of I happened to catch the wave the right way, or I'd learnt to swim, or I was stronger, or whatever it was, you know, or I was the next person in the line, or I wasn't downstairs below deck. And it was interesting for me because I sort of half knew that this was a story in our family, that there was a Macleod chap who was part of our family who'd done something absolutely heroic and saved other people's lives, but I didn't know much more about it. And interestingly enough, John's brother-in-law, so John's older brother Donald, my great-grandfather, he married a woman called Annie Gracie, and Annie Gracie's brother was a naval architect. He'd started life as a coracle builder in Dunvegan. He's referred to often as the greatest naval architect Britain ever had. And he designed a lot of the major ships in the First World War, and built them at Fairfield Shipping in Glasgow, in the Glasgow docks. And he was given, I think on the day that this happened, he was made a KBE. He was made one of the first KBEs. So within one family, two completely different experiences on the same day. And it sort of brings home to you, doesn't it, the kind of shock of life. But that part of the family, the Gracie part of the family, never ever referred to this story. And I don't know why. Maybe it's the great silence, as you refer to it. The second thing is, I'm really struck by how small decisions can be life or death. I mean, each of the instances that you talked about, just small decisions. You know, whether you stayed on one ship or you got on another ship, or you were so absolutely determined that you were going to get on the ship, or all of that, and that sort of. It does make you think sometimes, doesn't it? Maybe there is a divinity that shapes our end, rough hew them as we will, to quote Shakespeare. And also so close to success. I was really struck, and I gather that there's a bigger gap between where the ship went down now and the land than there would have been then.
Yes.
So it's tiny distance, really. And so close to Stornoway as well. It's just, that makes it all the more unbearable in a way as a story. There's a little bit of the Labour politician in me that thinks, no lookout. Well, yeah, I'm actually thinking of COVID. If we as a country had had a lookout, maybe we'd have been in a better place. And sometimes you do actually have to, that for me is the whole purpose of a welfare state. It's the lookout for everybody. And to quote John Donne, who was a priest in the Church of England and a poet at the beginning of the 17th century, and excuse the casual sexism of the early 17th century, but no man is an island entire unto himself. Seek not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Any man's death diminishes me because I am a part of humanity. I just think that's such an important part of what life is all about. My fourth point is, I love the story that you tell about waiting for the seventh wave, or the third and the seventh wave are different from the other waves. And I was learning earlier some Gaelic words. Well, I haven't learned them very well, but different words that exist in Gaelic for things that don't exist in English at all. And we have a bit of that in Welsh as well. But I love that intelligence of knowing the world around you and the natural world around you, and watching the light early this evening in Port of Ness, and how it was changing and flickering between different blues and greys, and just amazing. My fifth thought is, I think I'm right in saying that the captain was found with 2 life jackets on.
Yeah.
And
but nobody knows what's happened to his body.
No, indeed. But it's just sometimes in life it does feel as if there's one rule for one set of people and another set of rules for another set of people, and then the Admiralty defending itself. The organisation always defends itself. And actually that doesn't serve any of us any good, I think, in the long term. And you can think about that with, I mean, all the major institutions, the Church of England, you know, government, I mean, so many different institutions, and of course the Admiralty as well. And then you said he got away with telling a fib. I can't think of what that reminded me of in politics. I won't say any more about that. And then the final thought I had was, as I said earlier, I've hardly known, you know, this is a part of my family history that I've hardly known really, and this is the first time I've ever been to the island. Absolutely amazing, and one of the broadcasters was saying to me earlier, she said, isn't it interesting, because your great-grandfather, he was a minister in the Kirk, and you're now a shadow minister, different kind of minister, but I used to be a minister in the Church of England. I was a priest in the Church of England. I'm also the parliamentary swimming champion. So maybe swimming runs in the family as well.
Absolutely.
And I can sort of see my face in some of the photos in the family. But I just wonder whether the currents of history run really deeper than we ever really fully understand in our families. We're not just, we don't come out fully fledged. We're framed by the society in which we are, the family that we're part of. And sometimes even the bits that we don't even know about, that we've never ever known about, maybe have a bigger influence on us than we ever thought, because as I say, the currents of our own family history run through our veins in a way that we don't fully understand, and maybe that's part of the mystery of life. I absolutely adored the book. I've already got a copy, so I don't need to buy another copy, thank you. And I love the fact that you've managed to get photographs or images of so many of those who were lost. And I do understand why there was a great silence for a long time, because of that, empty chairs at empty tables, feeling that sense of we've survived but others haven't. And sometimes pain is just too difficult to talk about.
Indeed.
That's all I've got to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Malcolm, too. I could add my own family story, although it's not my family, it's Mary's family, really. But her dad was a 16-year-old teenager, and he ran from the village of Holham to the site on the morning. It was too late for them to do anything about it, but he was actually there. And he told his children that story when the youngest was about 5 or 6, I think. He took the 3 girls down to the site and told them the story. And I always think that's one of the people who started to break the silence, is my way of thinking about it. And then Mary herself, who was a teacher in the Nicholson Institute, she started to teach her pupils about it. And she took them down to the site to let them see where it all happened. And then when she retired, one of the things she wanted to do is to make sure there was a proper celebration, or rather commemoration, of the event itself. She wanted a proper path, for example, and the path that is there now is partly because of her lobbying for a path. And the other thing that she wanted to happen was to have a proper exhibition to tell the story of the Iolaire. Now, she was ill, so she couldn't do it herself, but this society, and in particular the women in this society, came forward and said, we'll do that. And they did it in record time, and it was a wonderful exhibition, and it was held in the Sandwicks Hall initially, and then in Stornoway, and it was seen by over 4,000 people. So it was a great success, all the work that they put in a very, very short period of time. I'm sure many of you here saw that exhibition at that time. Enough from me. Would anybody like to ask a question or make a contribution of any kind? Now's your chance.
There's a kind of hush
A si-
all over the world
Another
tonight.
silence.
Yes, indeed. No, nobody? In which case, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming along tonight. The next lecture is on January the 29th at 7 p.m. here, when Shonach from the Archive Service of the Cornwall will be giving a lecture. I can't recall. Malcolm, do you recall the title of the lecture?
Oh, I don't know.
No. We don't know the title of the lecture, but it'll be good, and we look forward to seeing you then. And I just remind you that if you'd like to buy a copy of the book, they're there. ARCA has a few here tonight. And thank you very, very much indeed for coming along, and we look forward to seeing you in January.